and welcome back to my ACE tutorial series. As usual, I'm going to start with the default preset, but this time I'll switch to mono mode rather than legato. And I'll start by blending equal amounts of oscillators 1 and 2 in the mixer section. Then I'll tune oscillator 2 up 3 semitones, so I get a minor third interval for each note I play. I want to add another sawtooth oscillator tuned up a fifth to make a full triad chord. So let's turn to LFO2, switch the waveform to saw, set the first tuning knob to semitones mode, and tune it up to +7. Then cable its output to the extra mixer input at the bottom and turn up the level. And we now have a full minor chord for every note I play. So what if I wanted a fourth wave tuned an octave above the fundamental? We'll turn to LFO1 in that case, set it to semitones mode again, and tune it up 12 semitones. However, there are no more inputs left on the mixer, so instead let's wire LFO1 to one of the left-hand inputs of the multiplier module below, then LFO2 to one of the right-hand inputs, then connect the output from the multiplier to the mixer. We now have 4 waves for each note I play, and I can balance the levels of the 2 extra oscillators using the knobs in the multiplier. LFO1 lacks the waveform options of LFO2, however. Let's cable it directly to the VCA1 pin for now, and turn down the scope frequency to zoom in. And we can see that LFO1 produces a sine wave, unlike the sawtooth waves from my other 3 oscillators. However, notice the LFO phase knob has a modulation input underneath it. If I wire the LFO back to its own phase modulation input to create a feedback loop and turn up the depth knob, our sine wave shape starts to skew over to the left and to develop sharp edges, and ends up pretty close to a sawtooth. So let's disconnect our temporary patch to the VCA input so we can hear all 4 waves in their full glory. And let's throw all caution to the winds and also dial in some square wave sub-oscillator for a grand total of 5 waves. These signals are all being mixed together before being sent onto filter 1. So if I turn up the gain for the filter to overdrive it, we get rich and dirty intermodulation effects between the 5 waveforms. Let's close down the filter, modulate it with envelope 2, and dial in a percussive pluck. However, what if I wanted a rhythmic, tempo-synced modulation instead of an envelope? As we're using LFO2 as an audio rate oscillator, turning up the LFO2 modulation knob instead creates audio rate filter FM, which can be a useful technique, but is not what I want in this case. So I'm going to wire up the ramp generator instead. By default, this is a trapezoid envelope generator with linear attack and decay stages labelled up and down, plus a hold parameter to hold the envelope at its maximum value before decaying back down again. Notice the rest parameter to the far right, however. At its default maximum setting, we have an infinite rest time before the envelope repeats. So in other words, it just triggers once for each note like an envelope. But if I turn down the rest parameter, the ramp generator will repeat after the specified rest period. So setting rest and hold to 0, and up and down to the same value, produces a triangle wave LFO. Of course, manually synchronizing this modulation to the tempo of the project would be fiddly. So let's switch to the tweak panel and switch the ramp clock parameter to 1/4 sync. If I now set the up and down parameters to exactly 25%, each stage is now the duration of a 16th note. So the triangle wave is now perfectly synced to 8th notes. And if I set the up parameter to 0 instead, we get a sawtooth wave synced to 16th notes. I want to be able to control when I add this modulation. So I'll wire the ramp generator to the first input of the multiplier to the left. Modulate the filter from the multiplier rather than directly from the ramp generator. And then connect the mod wheel pin at the bottom to the modulation input in the middle of the multiplier. And I can now adjust the modulation depth using the wheel. Now notice what happens if I swap the ramp generator over to one of the right-hand inputs of the multiplier instead. The modulation remains the same, but the action of the mod wheel is now reversed. So we have full modulation with the wheel all the way down, and no modulation with it all the way up. In other words, the effect of the modulation pin is reversed for inputs 3 and 4. And this allows the multiplier to be used as a crossfader. Let's connect a static high value from the +5 pin at the bottom to one of the left inputs. And the mod wheel now crossfades between the rhythmic ramp modulation and a static high value to keep the filter wide open. As in part 1, I can thicken this sound and make it richer by using the stack parameter to stack up multiple voices in unison. However, this parameter also provides another way to approach creating this type of sound. Let's start back at the default preset. Set the stack value to 4 to create 4 unison voices for each note I play. Then switch to the Tweak tab. The stacked voice tuning knobs allow us to tune each voice individually. And by default, voices 2 and upwards are set to gradually less subtle detuning. But I can also use these knobs to dial in larger tuning changes, such as a minor third for voice 2, a perfect fifth for voice 3, and an octave for voice 4. And we now have our stacked chord again, but this time using just oscillator 1. There are a number of differences between the results we get with these two methods, however. For example, we now have a separate filter for each of the notes in the chord. So if I drive the filters harder to distort them, the result is much cleaner sounding, with none of the complex intermodulation effects we heard earlier. And if I turn up the sub-oscillator knob in the mixer, we don't just get a single extra wave, we get a whole extra 4-note chord an octave or 2 octaves lower than the first. Plus, of course, LFO2 is still available, so I can set up my rhythmic pluck modulation by picking a sawtooth wave and a suitable sync value. Okay, let's pause for a moment and take a look at the output pins provided at the bottom. We have a choice of white or pink noise at the far left, followed by familiar MIDI controls such as pitch and modulation wheels, velocity and aftertouch, etc. But what's the mysterious mapper output at the far right? Actually, the mapper has a range of very different uses, but one of those is to apply different modulation to each of the voices in a stack like this. Let's wire the mapper output to a filter modulation input and turn up the depth. Then switch to the Tweak page again and take a look at the mapping generator in the middle of the page. We have way too many steps set up by default, so the first thing I'll do is right-click and set the number of values to 4 to match the number of voices in our stack. Then I'll set the mapping source field below to stack voice. I can now use the mapping generator to offset the filter cutoff for individual voices, in the same way that we can offset the tuning for each voice via the knobs to the left. Okay, let's switch back to the main page. And remember that, as well as a separate filter for each voice, we also have a separate LFO. So let's reassign the mapper output to the pitch modulation input of LFO2. Then set the depth to +12. As the mapping generator is bidirectional, I can now tune each LFO up or down by an octave, or in other words, double or halve the speed for each voice. And as the underlying maths is the same, tuning individual voices up or down by a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth will produce dotted or triplet patterns. That's all I've got time for in this video. Thanks for watching.